Hi guys, this is I'm Stuck and welcome back to our history series on America 1920 to 1973. Today we're exploring one of the darker aspects of the 1920s, and this is how fear created this prejudice in America against immigration. So the 1920s saw a dramatic shift in American attitudes towards immigration and foreign ideas. The same decade that celebrated prosperity and freedom also witnessed systematic discrimination against immigrants and a nationwide panic about communist infiltration. To understand the immigration restrictions of the 1920s, we need to look at how immigration to America had changed in the decades before. So between 1880 to 1920, over 20 million people had immigrated to the United States. This was one of the largest population movements in human history. So American immigration fell into two main categories. So there was old immigrants that had come mainly from Northern and Western Europe. So this is Britain, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. And these immigrants were often Protestant. They spoke English and they learned it quickly. And they were generally accepted into American society because they were seemed to be similar to the original American colonists. And then there was also the new immigrants. So these were different. So from 1880 and onwards, most immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this would be Italy, Poland, Russia, Greece, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These immigrants were often Catholic or Orthodox Christians or Jewish, and they spoke languages that seemed to be completely foreign to most Americans, and they had different customs and traditions. So many of these new immigrants settled in large cities where they created ethnic neighborhoods, for example, Little Italy or Polish Town and Jewish quarters. While these communities provided support and kind of familiarity, they also made integration more difficult, and it made immigrants seem more foreign to other Americans. The new immigrants also took low-paying jobs in factories, mines, and construction. This created an economic competition with American-born workers, who complained that immigrants were willing to work for lower wages and in worse conditions. So labor unions were often hostile to immigrants, seeing them as a threat to workers' bargaining power. Unlike earlier immigrants who came to settle permanently, many of these new immigrants planned to work in America for a few years, save money, and then return home. This temporary mindset meant that they were less likely to learn English quickly or adopt the American customs, and making them seem even more foreign to American society. And by 1920, about 35% of the population in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston had been born abroad. This concentration of foreign-born residents in key cities created the impression that America was being taken over by foreigners, even though the immigrants were still a minority of the total population. So the large numbers of new immigrants created a backlash movement called Nativism. This was a belief that native-born Americans were superior to immigrants, and that immigration should be restricted to preserve American culture and values. Nativists made several arguments against new immigrants. They claimed that immigrants were racially inferior. They argued that immigrants were too different culturally to ever become real Americans. And because they practiced different religions and spoke different languages and they had different culture, this meant that they could not adapt properly into the American culture. Nativists also blamed immigrants for various social problems. They claimed that immigrants brought crime, disease, and political radicalism to America. They argued that immigrant neighborhoods were centers of corruption that threatened American moral standards. World War I also intensified these feelings. The war made Americans suspicious of anything foreign, and many began to question the loyalty of immigrant communities. German Americans faced particular persecution during the war, and this suspicion extended to other immigrant groups after the war ended. So for the first time in American history, the federal government began to systematically restrict immigration. This marked a dramatic departure from America's traditional role as a refuge for people seeking better lives. The first major restriction came in 1917 with the literacy requirement. So immigrants had to be able to read a 40-word passage in some language. This was specifically designed to exclude poor and uneducated immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, who were less likely to be able to be literate than those from Western Europe. And then in 1921, there became the Emergency Quota Act, and this established the first numerical limitations on immigration. It set a maximum of 350,000 immigrants per year and limited each nationality to 3% of the number of people from that country living in the United States, according to the 1910 census. This aimed to limit new immigrant groups from coming in. This system heavily favoured Northern and Western European countries, while severely limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And in 1924, it got even worse. So the National Origins Act of 1924 made restrictions even harsher. It reduced total immigration to just 150,000 per year, and lowered the quota to 2% based on the 1890 census, before most of the new immigrant groups had even arrived. This virtually eliminated immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. To enforce these new restrictions, the government created the Border Patrol in 1924 and expanded immigration inspection services. The impact was dramatic, so immigration fell from over 800,000 people in 1921 to fewer than 300,000 in 1925. This changed America's character as a nation of immigrants. So, alongside anti-immigrant sentiment, the 1920s witnessed America's first major Red Scare. This was a nationwide panic against communist infiltration and revolution. This fear was triggered by the Russian Revolution of 1917, which established the world's first communist government. Many Americans were terrified that what would happen in Russia could also happen in America. So the Bolsheviks had overthrown the government, executed the royal family, and established a system that abolished private property and traditional religion. And Americans were worried that this same approach could occur in America, and that communists were planning a similar revolution in other countries. These fears seemed justified by events in America. So in 1919, the country experienced over 3,000 strikes involving 4 million workers. Major strikes hit the steel industry and coal mines and even some police forces. And whilst most strikes were about wages and working conditions, many Americans believed that they were part of a communist plot to overthrow the government. The Red Scare intensified after a series of bombing attacks in 1919. So bombs were sent to prominent politicians and business leaders, and one exploded outside the house of Attorney General Palmer. These attacks convinced many Americans that the communist revolution was imminent. So General Palmer responded with massive government raids, which were against suspected radicals. On January 2nd, 1920, federal agents conducted simultaneous raids in 33 cities, arresting over 6,000 people suspected of being communists. Most of these people were immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. The Palmer raids violated many constitutional rights. People were arrested without warrants, held without charges, and denied access to lawyers. Many were beaten during interrogation, and about 500 people were eventually deported, even though most of them had committed no crimes other than holding unpopular political beliefs. The Red Scare particularly targeted immigrant communities. Authorities assumed that foreign-born residents were more likely to be communists or anarchists, and this connected the fear of communism with the existing prejudices against immigrants, making both the problems seem even worse. So the Red Scare created a climate where expressing unpopular political views became dangerous. People lost their jobs for suspected radical sympathies, organizations were banned, and newspapers were censored. And the fear of being labeled as a communist or radical suppressed free speech and political debate. So now let's look at one of the most famous and controversial cases of the Red Scare. So this involved two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti. Their case became a symbol of just how far prejudice had gone against immigrants and how political radicals could corrupt American justice. In May 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and charged with robbing a shoe factory in Massachusetts and killing 2 guards. The evidence against them was weak. They had alibis for the time of the crime, and the main identification came from witnesses who admitted they weren't sure of what they'd seen. What made the case controversial was the defendants' backgrounds. Both men were Italian immigrants who had avoided military service during World War I and were known to be anarchists who believed in abolishing government. They spoke little English and did not understand much what was happening during their trial. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of intense prejudice. The judge made anti-immigrant and anti-radical comments throughout the proceedings, and the prosecution focused as much on the defendants' political beliefs and the immigrant status as on the evidence of their guilt. Sacco and Vanzetti were found guilty and sentenced to death in 1921. However, their case attracted international attention, and they spent 6 years in prison while their lawyers filed appeals. Prominent intellectuals, writers, and political figures argued that the men had been convicted because of prejudice against them, rather than the evidence. The case sparked protests around the world. Demonstrations occurred in major European cities, and American embassies were attacked by protesters who saw the case as an example of American injustice. Many people viewed Sacco and Vanzetti as martyrs to prejudice and intolerance. Despite worldwide protests, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in August 1927. Decades later, evidence emerged suggesting that at least Vanzetti was probably innocent. In 1977, the governor of Massachusetts issued a proclamation stating that the men had not received a fair trial and that any stigma should be removed from their names. So immigration restrictions and the Red Scare of the 1920s had profound and lasting effects on American society. Immigration laws of the 1920s remained in effect until 1965, drastically reducing America's diversity for over 40 years. The Red Scare established dangerous precedents for government suppression of political dissent. The idea that certain political beliefs were un-American and could justify arrest would return later during periods of national stress, particularly during the Cold War. Restricting immigration had economic effects as well. Some industries struggled to find workers, and the flow of immigrants may have contributed to labor shortages in certain sectors. The loss of immigrant entrepreneurship and innovation also had long-term economic costs. America's restriction on immigration and a Sacco and Vanzetti case damaged the country's international reputation as well. America had long been seen as a beacon of freedom and opportunity, but the events of the 1920s made it appear more like other nations that discriminated against foreigners and suppressed dissent. So the immigration restrictions revealed the darker side of American prosperity during the 1920s. While the decade celebrated freedom and opportunity for some Americans, it systematically excluded and persecuted others based on their origins and beliefs. These events perfectly illustrate several important themes in the 1920s. In the next video, we'll explore another aspect of the 1920s, and this is social division as well. And this was the experience of the African Americans and the continuation of segregation and discrimination despite the decade's prosperity. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.